If you think you know anything about Highlander, I implore you to please watch this video. You will learn something that you didn't already know. You can be fully prepared for Worlds, going in with Highlander, having all of the matchup knowledge you possibly need, and you will still learn something from this video. I want to make this as open and comprehensive of a guide as possible, while also showcasing a deck profile for what I took to New York and what I would be playing had I gone to Worlds if I decided to play Highlander. I will not be playing Premium for Worlds. However, if I were to be playing Premium for Worlds, I would either be playing this or another specific deck that I will go into detail with later, with the people I've been testing with to help them out for Worlds. This deck, I think the most likely possible deck that is going to win Worlds will either be this or that specific deck that I have been helping them lab. My list is slightly different from other Highlander lists, but for a good reason. I personally think it's better. I think that my list in particular has a lot of not just fail-safes, but lines of play that if you are actually knowledgeable about Bermuda, you will understand exactly why these cards are in this deck, and why in grindy matchups, in particular the Mirror, these cards may also come up. But first off, these are absolutely mandatory. Every Highlander list will run 2 Coutier and 4 Reindeer. So this is very standard now. If you saw the previous video, this is pretty similar, basically the same as the last list. However, with Reindeer, I mentioned in that video, if I'm not mistaken, that I was not a fan of Reindeer, and that was for a couple of reasons. First off, when you were riding down in that deck, it required a lot more moving pieces, and when you were dedicating that many moving pieces to an early game that only mattered on turn 3, you were basically compromising so much deck space that your deck couldn't actually play the game when you got to Stride, which was 90% of the time when the game was won in that format. On the other hand, when you were doing Reindeer, your ride targets that weren't your grade 3s weren't always that good. Now that we have not just new Bermuda cards, but also a lot of new really good utility in Lyrical Monasterio, that changes, and this card absolutely has to be at 4. Previously, people would run 3 of this, and they would do the ride down build, but they would cut one of these, and they would swear by it because you would only need 1 ride down, and when you went into Stride, whatever you rode into would be your final Stride, and that would be that. However, now that we have Heltruda, you absolutely need 4 of this because you need 1 to ride down into, and you need a second. Ideally, you would like to have a second for follow-up. You may be asking, why not just search it off Coutier and run 3? Here's the problem with that. This card counts as a trigger in deck, so Coutier can't add it. You have to hard draw this or filter into it with Betty, Sedna, Saria, Klasina, or any of the other cards that help you filter through your deck. What that means is that you are drawing through your deck to get to the follow-up way more likely, meaning that when you go first and you ride down on your opponent, and your opponent lets you Stride the next turn, you have to make sure you either have this card, or another card that is a good enough follow-up that you will actually be able to go into Heltruda and still get the 3+ Vanguard attacks and also be able to combo off Reindeer. These are the ride targets and other grade 3/4s that I play in my deck, and this will change depending on the player. Tirwa is an absolute mandatory card. You have to play this. This card does like 7 things. First and foremost, it is a restander. It can restand on Vanguard, it can restand on Rearguard. Very important. If you stack force markers on this thing, you put a crit on it, it's restanding with crits, really good on Rearguard, really good on Vanguard. Second off, when you ride this thing, you can bounce your field. That is crucial, especially last format into Narukami. This was almost always one of the best ride targets I would hit off of Reindeer when I was facing Narukami. Namely, you would hit this, bounce your whole field, you would basically just turn off their Stunverse. That's going to be a common theme you see with this, and that absolutely will come up in this format as well. Narukami won't be as prevalent, but it will still show up. And more importantly, Mega Colony is kind of coming back, and this interaction will absolutely cover that point of contention. Next up, the other card that is an absolute mandatory add-in is Anj. Anj does a very similar thing to Tirwa in that it bounces your whole field. Anj, on the other hand, is on attack, meaning that if you are playing for Anj, you don't have to swing your rear guards before your Vanguard when you're going into these lines of play. Sometimes when you're going into Reindeer and you either have to or you want to go into Tirwa, you'll have to swing your 2 rear guards first, and then Vanguard, just in case your only good ride target is Tirwa. If you do not swing those rearguards first and you ride Tirwa, you don't have to bounce those cards. However, if you want to get maximum value on Tirwa and still end on a empty field, chances are you will have to bounce those cards. Anj, on the other hand, as long as you have a counterblast, will bounce your whole field and then tutor anything out of your deck. This will get you your ride down in a different fashion than other cards will, but if you rip this off top 10, just know that as long as you're tracking what's in hand, deck, damage, drop, bind, remove from G-Assist, whatever, this card has access to anything in your deck as long as you're able to bounce 4 normal units. I have this card upside down for a reason. So this is usually Lupina. I like Lupina, however, with Highlander in particular, there are so many decks and so many gameplay patterns where by the time you either get to first stride or turn 3, it is very easy, especially back in Narukami format, to give your opponent 1 counterblast so that they have to either choose to Helltruda or Reindeer into something that can counterblast and basically limit their restand to only 2 attacks. This is not Lupina anymore, this is actually going to be Olivia. Olivia is a lot better in my opinion now, so the reason you would play Lupina is because this would be a grade 3, you could normal ride either on turn 3, or if you rode down on the crackback you could ride Lupina from grade 2 to 3, and then you could go into Helltruda and get some more restand combos, because you would have forces on the sides, you would get a couple more attacks. The issue is, when you're going for that line of play, and you're specifically adding and searching or just have Lupina in hand, that entire sequence of plays dies to a single defensive trigger. That's a problem, right? The other thing is that chances are you have so many other things you could ride, you're honestly better off riding a heal guard at that point. So this being a grade 4, being Olivia, is honestly not too bad of a deal. Olivia, if you're not familiar, Olivia essentially does the same thing as this. It reads, on attack, stand any number of different name rearguards. If you stood 3 or more, she gets a crit. So it is not a counterblast. You can basically do the same thing that Lupina does in the battle phase for -1 counterblast, meaning that if you go Helltruda into Reindeer, into anything in your deck, specifically Olivia in this case, you don't have to counterblast to resolve this skill and still push your opponent. Our last 2 ride targets, you will always see a Nezca. A Nezca is still a mainstay in the deck. You will this card is amazing. This card gets an Excel marker, which is the most important gift it gets, but it also does get force markers and protect markers, which are really good. Protects, dodge, guard restrict. They will dodge hand locking, not that that matters. They will dodge Rinne sometimes, not all the times, but there are very few fringe cases where Nubatama kind of hurts you. The other thing, there are a lot of really niche interactions with Inezca, and I'm going to bring this up really quick because honestly, this one grade 1 has more interactions with these grade 3s and 4s than anything else in the deck. I think it is absolutely one of the best cards in the deck. This is Appassionato Justine. I'm going to bring this up right now, just so I don't forget about it. All of these cards I mentioned interact in a different way with Justine. Ever since Helltruda came out and we went to 4 Reindeer and we had the option to ride down, I just put this card in immediately. Basically, this card does like 30 different things, and you have to be aware of every single one of them because it will do a different thing in every game that will come out in your favor, and you have to be aware of all of them. But first off, the most obvious one is when you ride Reindeer and you have Coutier and you add Justine and you discard for Reindeer to ride from the deck. You can discard Justine. After she resolves, you have a new grade 3. So Justine will then Soul Blast out the Reindeer, call herself to open. End of turn, you retire the thing you rode, and you choose a grade 3 and Soul and ride it naturally. But there's no grade 3s left, so you choose any card and Soul and ride it. So you ride a grade 2, so you ride down. Very simple. The next time this comes up is in that case when you're riding Tirua. So what you can do is you can use this, ride up into Tirua, then resolve Justine, Soul Blast color to open, then resolve Tirua, bounce her back to hand. In the mirror this comes up so that you're able to ride down another turn afterwards against Maidens sometimes if you're not already auto-beating them, because Maidens are the freest matchup this deck has ever had. Especially without the piano. Holy shit, that deck is free now. And the other case that this comes out is if you are going into Reindeer and you have a full field, and they are assuming that you are not afraid of Justine, and you either are guaranteed or have set up your deck and thinned your deck in a fashion where you are guaranteed to ride a Nezca, but your field is full, you can ride a Nezca, you can get the Excel, after she resolves, call Justine to the Excel, and then you have a surprise jump scare beat stick. You can put a force there, you can hit 21, you can not do that, and you can just hit like 11 if that matters. You can do whatever you want, just put Justine there, it's free. Another case where this comes up that lets you ride down is when you go Reindeer into Anj. And when you Anj, you search your deck for Tirua. So you ride Tirua, oh, but you haven't Soul Blasted yet. But when you do Tirua's effect, and you have the Counterblast, because you need 2 Counterblasts to do this play, you do Tirua, you Counterblast 1 after she swings, discard a card, you discard Justine, stand her. If you put a force marker anywhere on your other circles, you can discard Justine, call her to the force marker, and have, again, another surprise jump scare attack. That's just breaking the surface in terms of what this card can do. This card is absolutely mandatory. I will get back to it later, but again, with just these cards in particular, those are a couple of the interactions where Justine will come up. Next up, we have Laura. Laura is a new addition into the deck. If I'm not mistaken, I mentioned that I really wanted to put her in the previous deck, but she just didn't come up and she was a win more card. That changes now. So what Laura does now is a couple of things, and I will go into more interactions with her in the future. Mainly what she does is she thins your deck 5 normal units out. She calls a new field. If you were bouncing your whole field with Heltruda, you didn't want to call anything, you can just call stuff with her. She interacts with cards like Tirwa. I'll get into that later. And then furthermore, she is able to, if you're putting cards back with some of the cards I'll get into in a second, she can get them back out of your deck again so that you can swing with them. You can bounce your field with Heltruda. You can call the cards I'm about to mention, put those cards back that you just swung with, like Pearl Sisters or Tirwa, and then she calls them out of the deck and gives them 10k, which is huge. Another thing is if you're kind of behind and you just have Reindeer and you need either Coutier or you need some form of board presence, you can go into her, just go top 10, you hit this, you have immediately swung the game in your favor to such a margin that it kind of almost wins you the game. Especially in the ride down, there is barely anything they can do with a random jump scare Laura. Call literally anything you want off of top 10 and then just beat them in the face with it. It's insane. And then finally, this is not as much of a ride target as it is a combo piece, but I will go over it here anyways because it is a grade 3. I play a Lumesia. Not everyone plays this. This card trades insanely well with Rishis. Rishis is one of your best defensive plays. I'll get into her in a second. Rishis is basically one of the primary reasons you're even playing this deck in the first place. She's able to basically wall up your Vanguard so that they can't hit you. It's a defensive trigger as many times as you're able to call it to the field. When you're doing Rishis on opponent's turn, let's say you have G-Guards or Sandys or Pumos, who I'll get into later. You G-Guard into this. You call her, you give Vanguard 10k. Next G-Guard, you have to bounce her again. Then you G-Guard again, call her. That's 3 G-Guards just to stack 20. On the other hand, if you have Lumesia, you G-Guard 1, call Rishis, put 10k on. G-Guard again, go into Lumesia, bounce and immediately call Rishis again. That was the same 20k but for only 2 G-Guards. That might not seem like a lot. Here's the deal though. This deck needs to conserve hand as hard as possible. There are lines of play where if you do it even slightly wrong, you can't even stride Heltruda next turn. So you have to conserve as many cards as possible while also making sure that you have follow-up for the next turn. There will be a lot of times where you are very tempted to tunnel vision into a Pearl Sister or a Tirua play just to bash their face in. But realistically, what you should be doing is either getting Rishis, getting a defensive card, getting a G-Guard or something like that, so that you're able to wall up and then push them later. When you're searching Pearl Sisters, you have to be absolutely certain that that is your only out to winning the game. Otherwise, you're just doing a YouTube Yu-Gi-Oh combo and it gets broken by literally any deck in the game. On the other hand, as long as you're able to do a follow-up, push this turn, get the follow-up, and then push harder next turn, you're basically securing not just extra turns to win the game, but basically enough tempo to where your opponent has a very hard time coming back. This card does a lot of things in addition. So first off, when you are searching cards off of Coutier to bounce her and reuse her and deck thin, you can use her, basically as a copy of Slaney, who I don't play anymore for a couple reasons, but if you wanted to get basically Slaney, you can use her, counterblast, bounce, call her, search another card. Congratulations, this is another deck thin. Also, it's a bounce to your hand, you have follow-up, and you're able to conserve follow-up next turn. Another thing is if you have something like Coutier and you both want to bounce this and call this, that would usually cost 2 G-Guards. With this, it only costs 1 G-Guard. Also, it's a grade 3, meaning that worst case scenario, if this is the only grade 3 you rip off of top 10, you can ride this and still get a drive check, which is very good. You do like drive checks, and this get to a single one if this is the best possible thing you hit off of this. You don't always do that, but worst case scenario, it comes up. This is something a lot of people will argue with me about, and there is a very sound reason for why I do this. I only play 1 Aqua. This might sound like heresy to you, especially if you just came from my first Highlander video, where I was singing the praises of 2 Aquas because you can search 1 and 1 is always live. Here's the difference with 1 and 2 Aqua in this list. There are a couple reasons why you would play 2. The reason you would play 2 is because outside of Lumesia, the only card that bounces and lets you reuse Couture while also staying on the field and giving you a inherent +1 is Aqua. So if you're trying to do that 2 turns in a row, sure, that's fine. If you either don't see Couture, or you are trying to G-guard Couture on opponent's turn to search a specific out that makes you survive that turn, and you are running 2 Aqua, you either have to gamble on not seeing the thing you're trying to get to, or you have to search Aqua because you are not guaranteed to get the defensive piece. This lets you search the defensive piece indefinitely. Also, if you don't see her and you have Reindeer and you go top 10, the only 2 of normal unit in your deck that you could possibly go into that would stop her from riding is Couture. A lot of people will say that this deck and DI are the same because they're a draw the thing win the game deck, which is kind of true. On the other hand, this deck does so much without Couture that it is by far leagues above DI, to the point where if this deck doesn't see its thing, it both has more opportunities to get there, as well as the fact that it's also surviving to the point where it can get its piece if it's trying to troubleshoot it. DI, if they don't see the NLK, they are riding and playing vanilla Vanguard up until the point where they're going into Bladermouth, which is basically just them losing the game. The other thing is all the cards in this deck that get you to Couture have like 3 other purposes. In DI, if you were playing cards that got you to NLK, they would clog up your deck to the point where your deck would lose consistency. Whereas in this deck, you have so many natural ways of getting to Couture that if you're falling behind at all, it's by such a small margin that you're able to clap back a lot better later on. I'm gonna go over the next couple of grade 2s in tandem because they are not just good, but they all have very similar purposes and they will all be run in every Highlander deck. We have Saria, Standard, Lieselot, Standard, honestly one of the worst grade 2s in this deck, but we do still play it, and then Klasina. This is a new addition. This card did technically exist when I made the first video, but it just wasn't that good. Now that we're not just doing ride down shenanigans, but we're doing a lot of reindeer lines, this card does come up a lot more often. So a couple of things with all of these 4 cards. When you're riding down into grade 2, these all have on-place effects, meaning when you go back into grade 2, you have the option to resolve any of these effects to either go +2, call off the top, filter your deck, or bouncing a rear guard, which is insanely important. If you have Aqua on your Vanguard on turn 2 and you ride over her and you have Couture, what this means is if you're riding down, a lot of the time you would have to hold Couture in your hand to make sure you had her for follow-up. On this occasion, you can drop her down and search 1 more card because you're guaranteed to end of turn bounce her again with Aqua. Another insanely crucial thing is that if you ride Aqua and you do not see Couture, and you go into Reindeer, and you ride Ange, and you go Reindeer into Ange, bounce your field, call Couture from deck. End of turn, you ride Aqua, bounce the Couture, you just searched Couture and added it to hand. That is just one of the many things that this card can do that just provides utility. At the very basic, this card is thinning 1 card out of your deck and letting you reuse Couture. On the other hand, not just the combos I mentioned, getting extra value on Heltruda, getting extra value on stuff like Shandy, just like so many different lines of play that each of these cards provide that you might not even see them even if you're going into Worlds with this deck, there's something in here that you might not see. This card, Saria in particular, is another way. If you're riding down into her, another decent way of digging for Couture. It's only top 3, but again, it's really good. If you're riding down into Lieselot and you're going top card, chances are you either call it so you can bounce it next turn with Heltruda, or if it's something like another grade 3 that might come up later that you can put into Soul so it resolves, something like Tirawa that has an on-place, or a Nezca or Laura that has a really good on-place, and you want to ride into it after you do your reindeer plays, you can shove it in Soul. Very, very solid. The next couple of cards will also be mainstays in Highlander, namely Pearl Sisters. Last format, Pearl Sisters were bad. The only matchups they came up in were the Mirror and Regalia. The Mirror because if you had Pearl Sisters, you had a shortcut to the tempo swing when you were constantly riding down on each other so that your opponent was trading more cards in their hand than you were. I played a few Mirrors in New York and I won all of them. I did not see the Pearl Sisters outright, so I had to search them, but I knew how to manage them well enough to where I was able to beat them. Why I say this card was almost bad last format is because against things like Narukami, Granblue, anything that either removes or does like anything of the such on opponent's turn or their turn, You basically only have one turn of use for this card, to the point where you are always better off searching either a follow-up or a different line of play that is outing them in some sort of fashion. If you are facing a deck that will guarantee remove this, you only have one turn of use for it, so you have to both maximize the one turn of use for this and still either have follow-up or be sure that you have the tempo swing on your opponent to where it matters for only one turn. There will be matchups where you need a couple of turns of this, and for this to either stick on the field or sit in your hand, and neither of those are guaranteed, especially against Narukami. Cystico. This card has a lot of purposes. This card actually had a lot of very, very important purposes against Narukami last format, but this card will always be in the deck. If you resolved Aqua or any other card that bounced, she gets 10k power. If you're playing Yuika, really cool, she gets 10k power. Cool, nice, good, great. Also, she puts things back in the deck. She is probably the best addition to the deck that puts things from drop zone to deck. Everything else kinda gets clunky. I will bring them up when I go into the grade 1s and everything, but I honestly don't think they're that good in comparison to Cystico, where you don't have many good grade 2s. As you see now, I only have 3 more cards in my hand, meaning that I'm only playing 9 grade 2s. That's not a lot of grade 2s, because they don't have many good ones. On the other hand, Cystico has a couple of very, very important uses. In the Narukami format, you would actually search this card and put a grade 3 from drop back to deck, not just so that you could stay out of Stunverse range, but also, if you were doing this, if you drew it, or you added it, or searched off of Saria or anything like that, turn 1 to 2, you could use this, stun the Demolition Dragon, and you would be safer no guarding their Vanguard because they wouldn't be plussing as hard. Any type of on-hit card that has some sort of boost effect actually comes up when you're getting into Cystico, because when you're stunning that card, and you're stunting how much value they're getting in their boosters, and also just how easy it is to guard their lines, you do, again, get another curve of advantage that makes up for the fact that this deck is all one-ofs. I would say I stunned 2 demolitions in Swiss when I was in New York, and in testing this absolutely comes up, not just against Narukami, but against Genesis. If they aren't gauging, if they don't put a second gauge on Norn, or have a way to protect it, this will stun it. If they're on Frigg, yes, they have protection from leaving the field. However, you can target them. You can stun the Norn when it's gauged. It doesn't leave the field, but it also can't stand. So they either have to call over it, or they have to find a way to get it back somehow, and they are losing a lot of advantage trying to push for game. There are a lot of cards in this format that are actually really important to stun. Sandy, this is an extra G-Guard. Most people, if not all people, will play this. This is kind of a staple. This is a searchable G-Guard fodder, which honestly, like, there's no reason not to play this. Like, if you'll notice, like, a lot of these cards have, like, very minimum GB effects, because you want access to them on the ride down, but also, like, this card is too good not to play as a G-Guard. There are cases where this card is another deck thin, because you're searching it, you're using this to call Kuchir on opponent's turn, get another deck thin if you are already surviving their turn. This is a way to guarantee survive their turn if you search this in conjunction with Rishis. There's another card I'll go into. You've seen it in the last video. It's Pumo. It does the same thing, but it doesn't G-Guard, it just calls from hand. I'll get into that later and why that's good, but this is also just really fucking solid. You're also just able to discard this for a G-Guard and then put it back with either this or other cards I'll get into, and just do it again next turn, put it back into deck, add it with Kutir, congratulations, do it 2 turns in a row with basically searchable G-Guards, insanely valuable. Next up is Shiratsuyu. This is the only countercharger in the deck. You might disagree with me in that I don't play any other countercharger. Here is why I'm defending it. This deck, if you are building it optimally, namely I cut this for Olivia, if you're noticing a lot of other things, like not even like, you don't even have to resolve this if you don't have to, or if you don't want to. Sometimes this card is actually to your detriment if you resolve it, and you want to keep either things in deck or you want to keep the counterblast for later. You need to know that you have to be able to manage counterblast if you are playing this deck correctly. In Vanguard in general it comes up, but especially in Highlander. Yes, this card is a countercharger, but it is also a combo piece. When you're going into first stride, and you barely have the hand to discard off of Heltruda, this card can get you there. If you are going into deck thin plays like with Lumesia, CB to bounce it, and you don't have that much CB, and you want to be sure you have Heltruda plus a follow-up grade 3 that you can counterblast with, you can use this, refund the damage, and also get a discard fodder to your hand, because, spoiler, we're starting on Shizuku. This card is very crucial. On the other hand, there's another line of play that will rarely come up, but against a couple of decks where their only perfect guards are draw triggers, what you can do is you can add this, you can go into a stride I'll mention later, reveal the grade 0 Cystico, and block them from guarding your Vanguard with grade 0s. And finally, this card you will absolutely see at Worlds. This was Spica, can be Spica, especially in a format as grindy as one that prioritizes Highlander. I think Mine is absolutely mandatory in Highlander. Here's a couple of things this card can do. First off, it thins triggers. It puts ride targets back into your deck for reindeer. It puts call targets. If you do Heltruda and you have a really good field like Tirua or Pearl Sisters, and you bounce it and you call stuff and you call Mine, you can put them back into deck, call them back with Allura, and then give them 10k power. It can filter for Coutier. Yes, you will not always be only putting one card back. A lot of the time, you will be putting 3 cards back. On the other hand, Coutier is getting you all of those cards back when you search them. Here's the case that Mine will come up in this format, especially in Worlds, more so than any other format. Assuming that everyone, in particular WCC, anyone that has been studying or looking at Highlander on the low for the last season, you should be expecting mirrors. And in the mirror, it goes to deck out very often. Actually, more games than not, in the mirror, will either be one on the ride down, trying to push, deny stride, and then push again, or one person will go into ride down plays, and the other will just ride up, swing, and pass, have a vanilla turn, and make them go into stride, which is usually a suboptimal stride turn, because chances are, if they're riding down, they might not always have follow-up. They might be baiting you into riding down, so that they can spend another turn riding down and digging for the follow-up. What Mine does is it lets you ride up to grade 3, have a vanilla swing turn, get your drive checks, give them first stride, they go into their plays. Chances are you survive, because you're limiting their counterblast, because they're riding down, that requires either counterblast or resource management that they either can't get back or they have to very methodically prepare for. And chances are, a lot of that preparation is expecting you to ride down as well. On the other hand, if you give them first stride and you live that first stride, you get into the grind game, because you get to stride now, and chances are, you're thinning your deck out. Now you're constantly just walling each other up with Rishus, trying to maintain advantage. This is also where Lumesia comes in. When you're dropping Rishus on your opponent, and you're giving your Vanguard 10k power, and you're bouncing it and calling it again to give your Vanguard another 10k power, because again, Highlander stacks a lot of force markers and you need to guard all of that, you're spending less G guards when you're doing it with Lumesia than you would if you were doing it without Lumesia. So you're also conserving G guards. When you go into the late game, chances are a lot of decks will do one of two things, and both of them are valid, and I think you will see both of them at Worlds. One of them is Mine. Mine is able to guarantee that you win against your opponent through deck out. This in conjunction with Murtoa, who is honestly one of the most broken cards Bermuda has ever gotten. And I say that in the same video that I'm bringing up cards like Coutier. Just take note of that. But like, you're able to mill loop your opponent. There is an engine that you might see, you might not see, that plays Sarity, cards that recur from drop, sometimes Akari, and Murtoa, that are able to mill loop your opponent, and If you are on less cards in deck than your opponent, you can use Mine, go to more cards in deck than your opponent, and then the mill loop is live so that your opponent will run out of cards before you do. Pay attention to the streams, pay attention to the later rounds in Swiss, where the more seasoned Highlander players will show up. Into grade 1s, we have Sedna, very standard, grade 3 searcher, on call, top 5 for a grade 3. Pearl Sister, you gotta play both of them. Betty, again, searcher, very standard. Top 7, if they're all different names, you add one, you put a card back. I saw somebody in BRO a while ago, I'm not gonna say who, but they topped, and they added the stand, Dreamer Crook, off of Coutier. You can't do that, it's a trigger unit. She specifically says normal units. The only way to get that stand out of your deck is this card. So if you really care about that and you still play the stand for whatever reason, this is the card that does it. Murtoa, oh my god. This is one of the best cards that came out in 2022. Like, unironically, this card is broken. This card is so broken. Not just for Anj plays, not just for when you're bouncing stuff off of Heltruda, calling for Anj, resolving this in Justine. Anj is now live. Not just for that, not just for the fact that you can do this on your opponent's turn when you're G-guarding. When you would do your Lumesia Rishis plays, you can substitute Rishis for this card, and for every time you're calling this to the field, you're milling your opponent by 1. You can, against Golds, when they go into Ultima, use either Lumesia, bounce call it, do it a couple times. They stack 2 triggers on top of their deck. You can make them draw those 2 triggers with Mertoa. Into Granblue. That matchup will go into a grind sometimes, because there is a world where Granblue can stabilize against you and survive at the same rate that you're living their turns. Mertoa will deck them out. Regalia, another deck, gets through their deck very fast. When you're going into G-Guard plays, you can G-Guard this, make them deck thin. If they have like 4 or 5 cards in deck, this will happen very often. They did like Laurier to put triggers back in deck. They did a bunch of things to make sure they didn't deck out. And they swing with their Vanguard. And you G-Guard into Mertoa. And then you bounce call into Mertoa. And then you bounce call into Mertoa. Your opponent can hit the over trigger. Your opponent can hit 100 bazillion, gillion, trillion, more billion power. Deal 25 damage. But if your opponent's drive checking their whole deck out of the game, they lose before you do. So you can just deck out Genesis that way. DI. Oh my god, DI. 4 facts, right? Oh yeah, you need a certain amount of cards in deck or less to shuffle crits back. A lot of the time, they'll have like 7, 8 cards in deck, right? They go into 4 facts. They swing with their 4 facts. You use this 2 or 3 times. Let's say you do this 3 times, they have 7 in deck. They go first, second, third check. They pass turn, they have 1 in deck, you stand and draw. It doesn't matter if you lose your follow-up, you pass turn, they deck out. There's an engine, I mentioned it earlier, deck out loop. You can do in conjunction with Mertoa. It will come up in this format. There was a reason you didn't do it in BCS season, because it was not actually that consistent first stride. But if you're constantly facing Highlander mirrors, and they are going into the late game, as expected, in the same cases where Mine scales in value, you can also do the mill loop later on, guarantee yourself all of the pieces for it, and then it's that much easier to mill your opponent out. This card just does so much. Also, another thing, you can Reindeer, ride Anj from deck, Anj call out Mertoa, Mertoa Soul Blast out Reindeer, you get 2 more force markers, and you ride down. Insane. Oh, ride Reindeer, see top 10, you don't have a grade 3 or a grade 2 you want to ride, and you need to ride down, and you didn't see Justine, and you can't Soul Blast? Just ride Mertoa, she works on Vanguard, Soul Blast the Reindeer. You can ride down again. Like, this card does literally everything. Like, literally everything. So, like, okay. When you're thinking about, oh no, I give my opponent a card, that does matter exclusively in the mirror if you time this wrong. However, when you're using this in the mirror, you're exclusively doing it in those cases. When you're either riding down for a tempo swing, when you're going to deck out, when you're trying to make sure that they are either draw calling or just drawing or replacing cards that they want in their deck. Those are when you are using Mertoa in the Highlander mirror. However, in other matchups, this card will always be in your favor. When you're doing it on your turn, you are seeing the plus before your opponent is, and your opponent is losing that card, both because it goes to the field and also because they're losing more in hand with the offensive value this card provides, to the point where this card essentially just goes +1 for a Soul Blast every time you use it, and your opponent doesn't see any of the benefits. This card is just like too good. This is one of the best cards in the deck. If you're noticing here, with how much I'm explaining each of these cards, every single card in this deck has more than 2 purposes. We have Finessa. This has another multiple reasons it's in the deck. So what Finessa's here for, Finessa does a couple things. It puts grade 3s back. It does not specify normal units, so you can put heal guards back. It draws a card. It leaves the field. You can call it to the field, have it replace itself, and then discard that card for Heltruda. It goes to Soul, so you're able to Soul Blast for Mertoa later. It's able to recycle pieces you want to ride. Last format, this came up a lot because of Arakami, where you would go into Anj, you would bounce your field, you would search this, it swings, and then it leaves the field, so that your field is empty and Stunverse doesn't scale as hard. Very important. This card is just too good not to play. I think you will see this if you're going into this format, especially Worlds. Rolock. Not everyone is on this. Mostly WCC is on this. I picked up Rolock in this list about the same time they did. Rolock is insanely important. If you look at Highlander tops, you will notice that in finals, a bare minimum of 2, I think 3 Highlanders that made it to top 8 went up against a Spike Brothers player. And the thing with Spike Brothers is the reason you play that deck into this format is because it punishes ride down. When they ride down and they aren't able to do a Rolock or survive that turn because their heal guards are off, their hand is essentially as good as a grade 2 game hand, Rising Greedon will just punish you. And I don't entirely know how those games in finals happened in those top 8s where the Highlander faced the Spike Brothers and they lost. Again, this happened a minimum of 2 times, possibly 3 times this season. You can look at the tops and you can see there is a 2nd or a 4th place and it's Highlander, they lost to a Spike Brothers. And the only possible reason I could ever see that they are losing to Spike Brothers, because honestly, outside of Rising Greedon, that is one of the most free matchups in the game. Spike Brothers and Steam Maidens are literally, like, you don't even have to think against those matchups. As much as I'm talking about Highlander and the ins and outs of it, you can be the biggest Timmy in the world, and as long as you have a basic understanding of Bermuda Triangle and Spike Brothers, you should always be winning those matchups. Rolock, on the other hand, comes up into those Rising Greedon matchups. It comes up into those ride-up high roll decks, but it also comes up into the mirror, where you're riding down, you're getting Justine and Rolock as your 2 searches off of Coutier. You're able to basically 1-card PG one of the Pearl Sisters, or you're able to 1-card PG the Olivia. You're able to 1-card PG one of the huge crit swings that you got, either if they top decked or they searched Tierwa, put a crit on it. You can PG that. You can PG anything, basically. If they have like a really big guard restrict turn or whatever, they're going into DI, and they hope on damp you, and you can only guard in 20k value. You can drop Rolock, and a 10, you PG'd it for 2 cards, which would usually cost you like 4 cards if you were perfect guarding with a regular perfect guard. There are so many cases where Rolock comes up. Also, really quick, Elementaria Sanctitude. The order is not searchable off of Coutier. However, it is still good. I don't play it, but you can play it. It's good, but it's not searchable. You might see it. It dodges Hope on Damp. It dodges every form of guard restrict in the game because it's an order. I just don't play it. Because I think you have a lot of other outs to those decks, especially DI. You have so many ways of beating them. OTT, you have so many ways of beating them. DP, you have so many ways of beating them. This next card can be one of 2 things. This can either be Honolly, which will come up in 2 matchups, or Mistoff. Mistoff comes up in a couple more matchups. This card applies into more matchups than Honolly does, and that's why this card is here over Honolly. If you're looking at what Honolly does, why aren't you playing Honolly? Oh, it stops how many attacks you get. There are, I would say, 3 decks maximum where Honolly comes in, and most of the time, when Honolly comes in into those matchups, the timing does not make it so that Honolly actually does anything to your opponent. And those matchups are the Mirror, where you are trying to limit how your opponent attacks so that they have to either counterblast or they can't get more rearguard swings off of things like Laura, Anezka, Tierwa, anything like that. Or you're trying to drop it at a point where they have to swing in a different order. The issue with that is that when they're swinging rearguard, Vanguard, rearguard, Vanguard, on the 5th battle, they're going Vanguard, 5th battle. And then after that, they can just go Vanguard every other attack, and Honolly essentially does nothing. The next matchup is Grand Blue. When your opponent is going into the Break Ride play, where they need Night Storm, or they need Columbard, or they need Night Rose, or they need Bad Bounty, or they Break Ride, Bad Bounty, Night Rose, go into Skull Dragon, that's a lot of Counterblast. And those attack patterns fall perfectly in line with Honolly because they are required to then counterblast for each of those attacks, and basically their turn is cut in half. So Grand Blue is probably the most prevalent matchup where Honolly comes in. The final matchup where the Honolly comes in over this is Shiryuki. The issue with Shiryuki is I don't think that deck is that good. Yes, that deck scales into the late game better than any other deck in the game. The issue with that is that its early game and its grade 3 turn and its first ride are dog shit. It is good. They're good, okay? They're not dog shit. They're good, all right? But every other deck in the game either does what they do but better, or they punish the line of play that Shiryuki does. Basically, where Hanali comes up against Shiryuki is if they fill their soul up with 1,000,000 cards, and they have essentially a near infinite loop of Shibaraku victors constantly replacing themselves and calling over each other. Hanali will then limit how many Shibaraku victors they're getting. The issue with that is that Shiryuki is a matchup where you should probably be aggroing them slightly, meaning that when they go into that play, chances are they have a lot of damage to the point where even with only like 7 or 8 attacks with that Shibaraku victor, it's converting enough shield out of your hand to the point where it's probably still getting a late game curve on you. Where Mistoff comes up is a lot of cases. The mirror, Mistoff will always come up. The issue with Mistoff is you have to time this correctly. If you time Mistoff incorrectly, this card is a complete brick in your deck. Another thing that will punish you if you are playing Mistoff, but will also ensure that your opponent goes into a very specific line of play that will limit their options is, let's say they are going into Helltruder Reindeer into something, right? Okay, here's the deal. You have Mistoff. You're trying to figure out when to time the Mistoff because, if you do it too early, they can discard more cards and they won't be guaranteed to end on the more than 8 cards in hand. They can filter under that 8 cards and Mistoff doesn't have as much effect. If you do it later on, while your opponent has already walled up and they've gotten a lot of pieces, then it has more effect because it is kind of a surprise and you dropped it later on and your opponent has to discard more cards. Here's the thing in the mirror. Where Mistoff comes up in the mirror later on in those plays, chances are your opponent has a line of play that prevents you from even using this outside of Pumo, where they go Reindeer, right? They go First Stride and they Reindeer. I should have mentioned this like 1,000,000 years ago. First Stride into Helltruda, into Reindeer. They can go top 10 and they can choose something that's not a grade 3 or 4, which means that you can shut off their G-Guards. When you're shutting off their G-Guards, the only point of interaction any deck has that can call something is Pumo, right here, Secret Smile Pumo. I'll bring her out right now, she's basically a mini G-Guard, pretty standard, I mentioned her before. The only way Mistoff will have timing when they shut off your G-Guards is with Pumo. So you need Pumo plus Mistoff in order to sometimes time this correctly to where they're discarding cards. The reason this still comes up is because that's a very consistent line of play to go to, and your opponent, knowing that you have Mistoff, will sometimes choose to go to the grade 2 to limit the effect of Mistoff. On the other hand, if you add Mistoff, even if you're not using it, the fact that it just exists there makes your opponent go into a grade 2 instead of a 3 or 4, meaning that their power ceiling is insanely low now. They're basically wasting their Reindeer effect to turn off G-Guards for a situation that you might not even be going into. So you're getting tempo by adding this to hand and not even using it. So a lot of the time, this card existing and not even resolving is scarier than it resolving. Mistoff plus Pumo is your out to Gridora. Pumo is your only G-Guard, essentially, into Gridora because you can't conventionally G-Guard. And Mistoff will, a lot of the time, limit your opponent's hand, and more important than ever, if they have multiple blisters, they have to be discarding way more cards for those than they usually would, meaning that they have less cards to guard the other attacks with. This is going to sound very obvious to some of you, but the only perfect guard I play as a normal unit in the main deck is Transcendental Aqua. This is a perfect guard, yes. But more importantly than it is a perfect guard, it is one of your most cheeky combo pieces possible, and your opponent will most likely not even understand that. Even seasoned Highlander players will see this and they'll go, yeah, okay, I build a soul, cool. I can use Myrtoa and Yuika more often. Sometimes maybe Lumesia, right? Cool. Oh, that's what you mean by combo piece, right? No, that is not what I mean by combo piece. When I say combo piece, I mean this card will come in and it will completely shut off specific plays on your opponent on their next turn, literally just by what card you shove into soul. So when you read Reindeer, I might have mentioned this earlier, end of turn, it does not ride herself, it rides any grade 3 from soul. So what you can do, as early as turn 1, 2, 3, whatever, and you draw this, and you want to go into something later. Let's say you wrote a bad grade 2, but you drive checked Aqua. You can guard Transcendental Aqua, Soul Top Idol Aqua, next turn, go into Reindeer, do your ride down play, and then you have Aqua, meaning that you can call Coutier down another time to deck thin again. You can call anything else and immediately recur it with Aqua. You can Soul Klacina and essentially just go +2. You can ride something bad. Oh, you drive checked or added or drive checked Klacina, whatever. Guard Aqua, shove her in, end of turn, go into Klacina and get a bunch of cards. The other thing, into Narukami format where this came up, was where what you would do is when you were doing your searching, this came up against 2 matchups, Narukami and Mega Colony. Specifically the Cradle build, was you would the 2 searches would usually be Justine and Rolock, right? Any variant of Justine, Rolock, Murtoa, sometimes Mine, sometimes Rishis, sometimes also Finessa, very rarely missed off. And again, most of the time, any of the other cards are just extra and will get you into those plays eventually. What you would do in those matchups in particular is if you timed it correctly and the game state was in a specific situation where you were trying to out something like Gridora, Stunverse, Cradle, deny how many cards they were searching off of Cradle, deny the use of Stunverse, deny the use of something that either board wiped or made you lose cards from hand, lock, whatever, what you would do is you would search Aqua and you would search Tirua. And then you guard Aqua and you put Tirua in the Soul. You go into Reindeer, you do your play, end of turn, you ride Tirua. You can commit your whole hand to the field, and when you ride into Tirua at the end of the turn, you bounce everything and your board is empty, meaning that they can't Stunverse, they can't Cradle, their Gridora has minimal effect, and yes, it only bounces normal units, be careful about that, but there's another card that doesn't care, but it's not that good. I just wanted to mention it. It's called Bermuda Princess Lena. If you know Sakuya from OTT, it does the same thing. It says on ride, bounce everything, including triggers, which if you're calling out like heals or you're going into, the one other time where this comes up is if you're going into your deck and you're thinning to the point where you're either guaranteeing or you're playing for Laura, and you go into Laura and you go top 10, you call 5 cards, any 5 cards from that top 10, but they stick on the field. Oh no, they die at the next turn because of Stunverse, right? If you did this and you shoved in Tirua, and you went into Laura, and you called 5, end of turn, ride Tirua, you basically traded a perfect guard for a draw 5. Rishis, I already mentioned her, she calls down, gives 10k. If you're familiar with Dream Team, from G format, it was the Legion deck. It just stacked power with Koro and Vita and everything, and just got to like 40-50k. This deck does the same thing, but you have to G-guard for it, which is where this comes in, so you don't have to use as many G-guards. This card basically just walls you up to a 38k base if you're doing it correctly. If you're using the G-guard that gives 5k power, and you do this a couple times, you're going to 38 minimum, basically walling every relevant deck in the game, which is very, very, very big. Basically, any deck into Highlander has to constantly be playing, expecting the late game, otherwise Highlander will just constantly do like a borderline turn skip on you. Honestly, the most bannable card in Bermuda currently is Rishis, in my opinion. More so than Coutier even. I think Rishis is just stupid. Justine, I already mentioned how good she is. She's also just a body that comes back on the field that you can bounce later. She combos with every other card in the deck. She lets you ride down. She lets you jump scare call her. I already mentioned. Weddle. This can be a couple things. This can be a second Aqua. A lot of people will play a second Aqua for the reasons I mentioned earlier. The list that topped played a second Aqua, despite not really understanding the value of one Aqua versus Weddle, and mainly just for the reason I mentioned in the video, but there are reasons that you want to diversify the search targets. Namely, when you're doing Coutier and you're doing Aqua, assuming that you don't have a late game clock and you have another use of Aqua later, the game, especially last format, was so fast to where the 2-card deck thin always came up more than the 1-card deck thin with Aqua, because yes, it was 2 cards out of your deck, but also making sure you have this on turn 3 is crucial. If you are trying to either spam or try to unbrick yourself with Murtoa, or trying to unbrick yourself with this, and the only cards in Soul are grade 3s, and you might lose. You can put this in, Soul Blast the other 2, go back to grade 2, and you still have 1 in Soul. That's one of the cases. Akari will sometimes, if not most of the time, replace this card, especially if they're playing the mill loop. If they're playing the mill loop, they need Akari, or they would prefer to have Akari. Where this comes up now, and also if I was playing Yuika, which I wasn't playing for a couple of reasons I'll get into in a second, this card provides Soul, so that you're able to use this more liberally, and also just get to your lines of play that both deck your opponent out and unbrick you at the same rate. So, Yuika, right? I'm not playing her. Miss NFT Lady, Miss NFT Komi-san, right? I'm not playing Yuika. So, Yuika's good. I think Yuika has a place in this deck, definitely. The issue with Yuika, besides me not having or being able to afford her, is that early game, Yuika's good, but you have to draw her. Usually the only reason you are searching Yuika is because you are using her to boost something, and then bounce it, and then discard that card for Heltruda. At the same rate that you're doing that, you are also able to just call one card and discard the other one. So it literally doesn't matter. I think Yuika's good. I think Yuika's really good in terms of recurring a lot of these cards. You can call this, you can, going second, you can call this, you can call Yuika, bounce it back, use it next turn. It's the same thing as the Reindeer engine, or the grade 2 that rides and checks top 7 and then rides another grade 2. Those are cards you have to draw. It was the reason I wasn't playing things like Klacina, or Reindeer, or Rolock back in the day, because they just weren't that good. When you weren't writing down, Rolock at 1 was never live. Now, Rolock is live at 1 because you're searching and writing down. Maybe in the future it'll come up, but currently, not really. I am playing 3 draw PGs. These can be Sentinel crits. I honestly do just value the draw a lot more. Sentinel crits do come up if you are playing very ballsy against your opponent in either a mirror or a grindy deck, and you have to just 1-to-pass, no-pass, whatever. Crits will often come up. But the format is so diverse that ballsy 1-to-pass plays to tie-break even matchups don't always come up. So usually, again, the draw will come up more often. And also, if you are trying to play the game and do the lines of play that you were doing in this deck but you don't have Couture, you're more likely able to survive with draws than you are with anything else, and you can still play the game without Couture. These are very standard. There's no reason to not play these. A lot of the time, you want to either hold your grade 3s to call for beat sticks on Heltruda, you want to put them into deck with Mine, you want to do any combination of those things. You just need more stride fodders. Yes, we play a million grade 3s. Oh yeah, no, there's a way you can not. No, you need these. Like, with the fact that you're writing a grade 3 from hand, getting a follow-up which is a grade 3, and then also you need to discard a grade 3 to stride while also saving your G-Guard, means that you have way less targets than it seems. Also, you're trying not to discard Couture, because that's bad. This, I am playing 4 of Aqualight Ardell. This is actually a combo piece. More so than it is a way to dig for Couture, more so than it is a way to unbrick yourself. This card is very, very solid. So, especially in the Narukami matchup, this was one of your most crucial combo pieces. I'll go over the very basic one. You go into Heltruda, oh, you don't have enough cards in hand to discard? Call Ardell, put her in soul, draw a card, discard it. Cool, right? Okay, basic. Everybody knows that, okay? Into Narukami, what you'll do, also into other decks that you want to save your field and bounce stuff, you'll call these. You will not activate them when Heltruda swings. You will bounce them, and you will call them again on Reindeer. You will swing Reindeer. You will have these things to put your triggers on. Then you ride another grade 3. You swing with these, and then the grade 3 swings, and then you put them into Soul, so that you have nothing on field. Another one, into Narukami, is when you were playing Rate. There was a world where there was so much Narukami, and it was actually a difficult matchup for this deck back then. There was enough Narukami that would justify this, where you would play Duo Temptation Rate. And what she would do is, if they were Demolition, Stun versus whatever, you guard early, you call this, they bind it, you have a Ardell in bind. And you have a Rate, right? You go Vanguard into whatever, you bounce this, you have one of these in hand. And you go into Rate. And you swing Rate, you use her effect. Yes, Rate is usually just a restander that gets you a force marker. On the other hand, she's a combo piece with this card. So what you'll do is you'll use Rate effect, discard this, call this out from bind, and then she restands. And then you swing with her on a force, and then you swing Rate, and then shove her into soul. You just took a card from bind and turned it into a card in your hand, which is Not always good, but in the cases where it came up, it was winning you the game. Again, I might have mentioned it in the previous video. There's a line of play requiring the Tier Stride to where you can basically stack your deck for whatever triggers you want. You can stack the OT, you can stack basically whatever, as long as you're able to swing Vanguard, second swing, resolve a bunch of Ardels, draw into your stack, and then just swing with it, and then have basically whatever trigger you want as a single drive check. Pretty solid. For heal guards, absolutely mandatory. They have to be heal guards. Heal guards trade way too well. There's never a reason to play the countercharge soul charge one. There's never a reason to play the 20k. It has to be heal guards. They trade too well. They're searchable off of your grade 3 searchers. You can put them back with Finessa. They're just too good not to play. You have to play them. OT. Now, you can either play this or the Cray one, and they come up in different scenarios. However, this one is live in more stages of the game than the Cray one, and the other thing is that I would say the previous format is a good example. The Cray had a lot of merit to it because when you would check it on that turn, you didn't have many turns to grind the game out. And then again, I mentioned Cystico, so starter, right? Guys, we got through the main deck. We're finally through just the main deck for Highlander. Now let's talk about the G zone. That's pretty important because this will actually be different from mine in Worlds. So we have 2 Heltruda. I played 2. When you are going into Worlds, 3 is correct. 2 was correct the previous format. Here's the thing. In the Highlander mirror, you need 3. Into grindy decks, you need 3. Into the previous format, there was never a reason to run a 3rd. If you were ever going into the 3rd in the previous format, even into the mirror, you were probably already losing. And you probably should lose. Because the previous mirror, despite no cards changing in Bermuda in terms of the ban list, the mirror pre-ban list was immensely different from the mirror post-ban list. The mirror pre-ban list almost didn't even have the deck outlines of play as an option. They were usually just going into high roll ride down plays and just trying to aggro your opponent out. At which point the 3rd never came up, and there was not a single deck in the format where you ever needed a 3rd, nor was it even a utility piece. So 2 was always correct back then. On the other hand, you play a 3rd now, and I'll tell you what to cut for the 3rd. I'll tell you how I would build this if I was playing this at Worlds. Next up, not a lot of people play this, but I think it is correct. This is 2 Splendid Fortune Cystico. This is one of your ways of searching Coutier, one of your ways of searching other grade 3s and 4s that you might need, namely G guards, very important. But also, as I mentioned earlier, if you add this from soul to hand with Shiratsuyu, you reveal it with this, and they can't use draw PGs, very big. This card can both unbrick you, and is also a card that, ignorant of everything else in the deck, is able to unbrick you without requiring a specific piece in your deck for that purpose. If you remember my previous video, I played Alk, and I don't play her anymore because I don't play Aina. The only reason you would run Aina is because of Alk, and the only reason you would play Alk is to unbrick yourself. Meaning that if you put Aina into your deck, you are putting a brick into your deck for the purpose of unbricking yourself. The lines of play that get you Alk, yes, they seem good, yes, they can stabilize you, but they actually don't give you as much value as going Heltruda Reindeer. It sounds very weird. I know, it sounds very weird, because Heltruda's discarding 3. On the other hand, Heltruda is both bounce calling, letting you recycle Coutiers, letting you reuse cards, pushing more cards out of your opponent's hand, having a higher attack ceiling instead of just 5 attacks maybe with Pearl Sisters like Alk did. There's just not a reason to play Alk anymore. This stays the same lines of play as before. You can call Ardell behind it, get Harmony, call 2 out, and then shove Ardell in, draw a card. This gets you to Coutier if Coutier is absolutely the thing you need to get to. This can also combo with Lumesia, where if you get Lumesia plus a thing, you can bounce with Lumesia one of the things you got with Shandy, and then call something else out, so you basically add a card to hand, like you get a heal or whatever, you call the heal out of deck, you hit Lumesia, you bounce it, and then you get something else. Same thing with Aqua. Very important. There will be niche times where this comes up. It doesn't always come up. Megan! We're running 4-ofs now, so we can do Megan! Megan actually came up in a couple of situations. She actually combos with a lot of cards in our deck. She lets us recur Pearl Sisters, she lets us recur Coutier to thin into triggers. You can actually go into Megiddo as a tempo play to revive draw pieces and then win the game on Reindeer next turn. As odd as it sounds, that is actually an out you can play too. Also, just as you're going through your Heltruda plays and your Reindeer plays, constantly just put a million force markers on one circle. Megiddo is average hitting 70 to 80k lines if you're going for that line of play. And again, that's very valuable. This will also come up against Mega Colony, where chances are you can't call from drop, but you are constantly amassing force markers. So you're putting force markers here, you're calling 5 from hand, and then before your Vanguard attack so they can't blister, you're just swapping cards out on that one force marker circle to constantly just hit numbers. Also, just make sure you don't put the cards in the same column as Garaf because they can't move, so you just put it in a different column, you know what I'm talking about. This card is a way to stabilize. Another really big thing with this card in particular is, let's say you ride any grade 3 in your deck, and you have Perfect Performance Ange in your hand, and you call Perfect Performance Ange. When you go into Mine says if you have a rear guard with the same name as your Vanguard. These two cards have the same name. So when you do Mine, you only have to put one card back. It doesn't come up all the time, but it comes up sometimes, just like everything else in this deck, and it is worth mentioning because chances are that situation, if you're playing enough games with Highlander, will come up. In general, this is your best stabilizing play, better than Alk ever was. The only downside is that you can't do it first stride anymore, but if you are giving your opponent first stride and you have a G-guard or an out to survive their turn, this is a very good way of stabilizing. Again, you're just as likely with this deck as the previous many variants of the deck to end on like a 20 card hand if you go into this card. Tirwa. This card has a very different purpose in this format than it ever had before. This is actually going into the mirror and preventing you from deck out. So back in the day, yes, this was coming up against decks because you needed a way to restand, you couldn't always afford Heltruda, you couldn't always afford Reindeer even, you needed to pressure a bit more. You just needed numbers, right? Sometimes you go force 2 and go into her. Not always the case, but sometimes it happens. Right now, chances are, this might go to 2 in the mirror if you are trying to win the War of Attrition for deck out, to the point where this might actually come up. I'm only playing 1 because I don't think there's ever a reason to go into a second, because there will usually be a window of opportunity if you go into 1 and you're trying to live through deck out, that the next turn, or that same turn that it's possible, chances are you're already being able to deck out your opponent with Murtoa. So that's why I don't play 2. You also have so many other ways of troubleshooting the deck out mirror match problem, like this card, that, again, 1 is usually fine, but I can see a world where 2 comes up, but I just am not really building for it right now. Another card to unbrick you, if you're just really down bad, and you don't have Counterblast, and you don't want a Reindeer, and you want to save the cards in your hand and stabilize, then this comes up. The thing is, if you're saving the cards in your hand with Reindeer, and you're going into this instead, you're not actually plussing that much, and chances are you're using those cards that you're holding that turn to guard next turn, and you're losing them anyways. I'm only playing this still because there are times where it is your only option. It's unfortunate, but it does come up. I'm currently playing 2 Citron. This will be going to 3 in the world's list. I will show you the G-Zone and how it changes in a second. This is the card that gets you your Disruption. This is also the card that if you were playing 2 of this and you weren't playing Lumesia, you were always shotgunning this, and you would always run out of them, and you would always need 3. If you look at the WCC list at the top and they played Highlander, they were always playing 3 of this, primarily because they were not playing Lumesia. When you're playing Lumesia, you do not need a third of this unless you are going into a grindy matchup. When you are going into a grindy matchup, you need both the third of this and Lumesia to get the curve on your opponent and consistently stack power. On the other hand, last format and this format, in a vacuum, 2 is usually fine, but the third will come up. These cards are functionally the same thing. This one just works on 0 damage. Going into this format for Worlds, this will go to 2. There were a lot of cases where this was actually needed at 2 previous format, but I only played 1 because I knew how to manage it. This card, being at 2, is no longer the case. I played 2 Sandy for a very specific reason, which was DP. you were not guarding the Vanguard with this, you were guarding the rear guard that they stacked power on with die arm with this. If they die armed, and you had 2 G guards, and you had a big enough hand, you were 1 card G guarding both of the die arm columns, which was huge. That was one of the many cases where this came up. Into the mirror where they're stacking force markers, sometimes this comes up at 2, but you have better lines of play that can serve your G guards instead of this. If you're trying to hold pieces that you don't want to call because they're getting removed, then this is usually better. On the other hand, into this next format, that does not come up. So usually, this will be another one of this. Finally, Dismal. This actually comes up, oddly enough, not just Narukami, this will come up in the mirror. So, where this comes up in the mirror, what'll happen in the mirror, especially in the previous format, not so much now, is that in the previous format, in the mirror, they would swing a bit, and then they would start targeting your Pearl Sisters. With their Pearl Sisters or their other cards, they would just start trying to bash them so that you would be down a Pearl Sister and they would be up a Pearl Sister. What you do here is, let's say they attack Vanguard for a number. Chances are it's 28 to 38 because they put a force marker on Vanguard or rear guard. Usually it's 38. You G-guard Dismal. You protect a Pearl Sister and you no guard. So when you hit a defensive trigger, you put it on the second Pearl Sister, so it's harder for them to hit either of them. So if you didn't have this, right, and they were swinging into a Pearl Sister, and you hit a defensive trigger, and you put it on one, they would just swing at the other one. But if the other one is Dismaled, it's harder for them to hit either of them now. What you can do instead of Dismal, and this will not always come up, is you can play, there is a Melody card called Top Star Sierra. You might be familiar with her if you played Melody format. She searches Melody cards, that doesn't matter. What matters is that she says anything in front of her on rear guard cannot be attacked. So you can put her behind a Pearl Sister, have the other Pearl Sister there. This one can't be attacked. The other one, as long as they're attacking Vanguard for 1 swing, asking for a couple of cards from hand to guard, as long as you're at a damage threshold where you still have to guard the Vanguard, and you guard, no guard, whatever, and you take a damage and you put it on the other Pearl Sister, same thing as Dismal, it's harder for them to pinpoint target your Pearl Sisters. One more card I'd like to mention that I would cut Dismal for in the previous format and also this format is Ballerina. This comes up against Grand Blue, this comes up against Bugs, and this will sometimes come up against the Mirror if you are searching certain cards. There's a world where the Mirror isn't searching enough cards into this card, and you would go into this card and beat them because you had it and they didn't. Which is another, again, why Dismal would come up into the Mirror was because if they were going into Ballerina, chances are you were at 3 to 4 damage usually. It is very hard to get the Mirror to 5 damage reliably enough to where this is put into your G zone for that reason. So usually you're at 3 or 4. You guard, no guard, whatever, right? They swing a couple times, they break some guard, and then they swing the last time, you G-guard Dismal, it has resist, they can't kill it. That's another way Dismal comes up. The changes I would make going into the Worlds format would be I would take one of the Sandys, and I would play another Lucrece. I would keep her in, she needs 0 damage. I would actually take a Dismal out, oddly enough, because the Mirror match isn't as reliant on Pearl Sisters to win as it used to be, and I would put another Citron in. And then finally, I would do one of 2 things. I would most likely take out Anj and put her in as another Heltruda. But there is another world where I either take out this, or oddly enough Megiddo, and play another one. I think Megiddo is too good into Bugs, and I expect some Bugs at Worlds. So I would keep Megiddo in. But either of these cards should probably be a 3rd Heltruda going into Worlds expecting Mirrors. So I'm going to go over a couple of techs in addition to a couple of engines that you can play in this deck that have varying purposes. The first of which that I would like to mention when I was testing for BCS season was I was playing a second Weddle and Yuika, because when you were doing Yuika and Myrtoa, you would need 2 Weddle in order to get enough soul to consistently do your plays. When I took Yuika out, I was not requiring as much soul, and honestly, Yuika seemed like a waste of soul to that point, where I only needed 1 Weddle to constantly resolve my effects, and I just took the second out and I never looked back. You might be familiar with Nightmare Dolls riding into a 10k to get the curve on the Mirror. That actually comes up sometimes in Bermuda. You can play one of the 2 12k bases in Bermuda, as well as sometimes, not all the time, vanilla crits. So a couple of things about these. First off, these are 5ks, so they hit 15, meaning that if you put them on a force marker, they hit for 10k shield into a 10k Vanguard. Very big. Another thing they come up in is sometimes, not all the time, actually barely at all, you play 3 cards that flip it, but if you play any of the 3 cards that flip Cycloned and are, for whatever fucking reason, flipping up Cyclone. Despite Helltruda, Shizuku, Megiddo, none of them actually flip up Cycloned. If you're doing anything that flips it up for whatever reason, you can just play these and you have more beat sticks. Cool. But the 12k does come up if you're riding down. It makes guarding patterns a little easy. A little bit easier. You can actually search this and shove it in with Aqua to ride down into it, which is nice. Yeah, they come up sometimes, not all the time. But yeah, the 5k triggers are decent too. Spica. This came up a lot before this format, but now that Mine's in, I cut Spica for Mine. Steza, if you're trying to dig through your deck for whatever reason for more cards, if you, for some reason you need even more cards than you already have, then yeah, Steza comes in. If you're going into mirror matches, and you are going into the deck thin plays and the deck out plays, right, with this and Murtoa, and you're trying to get enough hand to put back everything you want into your deck, Steza will actually come in because it's able to draw through your deck so that when you're putting things back into your deck is thinner and it's more guaranteed to see the cards you put back. This comes in for a couple of reasons. First off, naturally, grade 3 searcher, get Coutier, get heal guard, yes, really good. Bouncer, call her, use her multiple times, get multiple heals, cool, got it, nice. This is a grade 1 Shizuku, so when you go into your Shizuku play and you reveal the grade 0, if you have this in hand, you reveal the grade 1 Shizuku. You can also play Full Bright Wish, the grade 3, do the same thing, block them from guarding with grade 3s, not that that ever matters outside of DP, but cool. If you want to block them from guarding with grade 1s, nice. You can stop them from doing Aqua PG, BPGs, whatever they have. Maidens plays grade 1 PGs, you can block them out of doing that too. Spiana. This card is another way of countercharging, another way of putting things back into deck, another way of making Perfect Performance a 1 counterblast play, because you can stride Perfect Performance, call Perfect Performance, and resolve Spiana. Let's say you do another Megiddo turn, or you do anything else. You call Spiana from grave, or you call her from hand. Every time you do this and you're shotgunning G-guards, you put another heal back. Meaning that if you deck thin enough with Megiddo into Coutier and Spiana, and you thin everything besides heals out, when you're in time and you do your drive checks, and you check 1 or 2 heals, and you go under your opponent's damage, you auto-win in time. Earl is another way of putting cards back into the deck, but we just have better ways of doing it, so I don't play her. She actually came up a bit against Narukami because it was another way of denying Stunverse, but you just don't need her anymore. DPGs, same thing. Most people will play DPGs. I believe a lot of the WCC lists were playing DPGs, but I don't think you need them. Yes, there are a lot of games where you are guarding with your entire hand and this will be live. On the other hand, it is just not worth it the other half of the time because chances are this card would just be better off as an Aqua, let's be honest. We don't have space for this much countercharge, and also this is a lot of Soul Blast, so we don't play her anymore, but she's an option. If you want to Soul Blast that extra grade 3 Soul Charged, if you're really trying to shotgun Shiratsuyu, then sure, congrats. This card comes up rarely. There's a world where you go Force 2 and this card goes in your favor. There's also a world where you go Force 1, stack it all on rearguard to either prepare for a Megiddo or to prepare for a Tirua/Pearl Sister play, where this card just makes your Vanguard hit better numbers. This card and Great Ascent Liddy come up in the same fashion in that they are able to stack a little bit more defensive power. The issue is, your entire deck does that already. If you ever want to get more defensive power, then cool, but you don't need her. This card, on the surface, protects your board. You do this in the Unguardable play with the Unguardable engine that I am not playing because it's a very copium engine. But the only real reason you would ever play this is for that engine to protect your pieces. Because this card, realistically, this has to be in the front row. They can just target it and then target the thing they were killing. And like, it just doesn't come up. Let's be real. Like, there's so you're better off with Connell instead of this to protect your shit. This is a budget card. This is the only reason to play this card, is budget. If you can't afford Laura, this is the next best thing. If you don't want to spend the $70 to $120 on the Laura, then just play this. We also have Akari. Akari comes up again. If you need to draw to get the curve on your opponent and you really value the draw, you play Akari. The other case is when you are going into the deck out play and you're drawing the card you're putting back, very crucial. And Bikun, again, I cut Bikun for now, but Bikun could come in again if you're that scared of something like Regalia. Eileen can come up to stack your deck sometimes. If you need a defensive trigger plus Rishis to live, then Eileen can come up sometimes, but again, you're already getting multiple Rishis uses with Lumesia, so it doesn't always come up. But under the case that you need 3 defensives or another defensive without having to shotgun the Lumesia, then Eileen can come up. Lumesia is a card that says, on ride, reveal a grade 4 from hand, and you basically get to mulligan. That card actually comes up because you can ride it off of Reindeer and then mulligan your hand and try to dig for Coutier. So it's not just live turn 1, it's live later on in the game too. It also shuts off G-Guards, which is nice. And if you're trying to turn any combo piece you want in deck back into deck and then draw for better cards, she actually does come up in those niche cases. Isabella is another card I saw some people playing. She reads, on place, Soul Blast 2, give 2 things 5k, if you have 5 rearguards, draw a card. Again, too much soul. It's a good card. It's decent early game, but it's just not that great. Ermeli is a card that retires herself and returns 2 non-grade 1s from drop back to deck. It's okay, but again, we have so many other ways of getting that, it's just not worth it. Rika's another one. Rika's the duo grade 2 that says when she's bounced, countercharge soul charge. She actually does come up. The issue with her is that random soul charging punishes you very hard in this deck. Manon is a promo that reads, on attack, CB1, bounce something, get that card's power. That card came up in the Narukami matchup in particular because you would use it after Held True to Reindeer and everything, bounce a card, and you would have minimum bound with Stunverse. The issue is, again, you have so many other ways of clearing your field by the end of the turn where that wouldn't really come up. It was a card that did one thing, and you don't want to play those. Clownfish comes up. The Clownfish is very good. The only issue is she Soul Blasts 2, but it absolutely refunds it, because if you're doing her, chances are you don't need to do Murtoa, because what she does is when you ride a grade 3, you can use her, Soul Blast, I think 2 or 3, one of the 2, I always forget, but she draws 2 cards, which is insanely valuable because if you don't see Justine, she is sometimes a better ride down target than Justine. Bobo. Bobo will actually come up in this format, oddly enough. There are matchups, namely the Mirror, where you will sometimes damage deny them in order to get to that deck out game state. And Bobo will come in because he will make Heltruda into Reindeer into a counterblast play live, to where that's actually getting you the upper hand on your opponent, because it's getting you the cards in your hand that you need to survive. There are times where you need that counterblast for on. There's a grade 3 that does something similar to Tirawa. You can also play that as a way of clearing your field into Narukami and Bugs. I don't play it because, again, we have so many other routes of getting there. The Light Genius Anj will also come up in a lot of matchups. You can ride into her off of Reindeer and Soul Blast the Reindeer, letting you ride down, and also bouncing 2, very big. It also just has the general grind factor that it always had, which, again, you ride into it, it's constantly amassing you advantage, being able to bounce call Coutiers, just very solid overall. And the final one I'd like to mention is actually Colorful Pastoral Caro. It's another card that when you ride it off of Reindeer can Soul Blast Reindeer. You never search a second copy. You just do it to Soul Blast Reindeer to ride down. It's not great, but in terms of cards that you can ride and Soul Blast, it gets you a force marker, which is, besides Anj, the best possible thing that you can ride into and still Soul Blast. That, aside from the fact that she's an 18k booster, are her 2 things that she does, and she does nothing else. Every other game state, she is a brick. Let's go into engines really quick. One of the engines is playing a second Anj and going for a very wall-oriented build, where you are going into Anj turn 3, bounce calling Coutier, and just walling up so hard that you are tanking turns. Into MFD and Ripple format, there was a list that played 2 Anj and a bunch of wall cards, and was able to completely wall a triple MFD turn and then crack back next turn and just win the game. That's not necessary anymore, and it's also not very consistent. The only reason it was a thing back then was because those decks on their high roll were so insane that you had to play for a high roll of your own. But again, it is an option, but it is not as consistent as any of the other options I've gone over. Another one of the options that Nico will swear by is the Cerity engine. What the Cerity engine provides is another couple of ways of recurring and plussing. The only issue with that is that that's all it really does. And in a deck that is now striding a card that scales based on the grade 3 you ride, Cerity isn't doing much. So you're usually turtling on Cerity to get a really good defensive hand, go into the unguardable play, and that's your only out. You have so much less flexibility in that deck that it is a very big difference. List's last format would play the Riviere engine. The Riviere engine was always very solid. It's essentially there to protect your field. There's a grade 1 that says if you're on Riviere, your field is basically protected, so they can't actually disrupt you, which actually gives you a very favorable Narukami matchup at the cost of basically just 2 bricks in your deck. If you were expecting enough Narukami, you could actually just cut both Pearl Sisters for those 2 cards, and you would immediately have a better Narukami matchup. The Coral engine. There is a world where you can go into a convoluted piano turn with the Coral grade 2 by searching out a Coral, using the grade 2, as long as you have an Excel Circle or a Tier 1, or are able to just get a lot of multi-attacks off of like Heltruda plus Excel plus Tirwa, you're basically getting a piano turn, making it 2 or more cards to guard as long as you have this grade 2 resolving. It's okay. There are ways of building it that are consistent, but in a vacuum and also into a world's environment, it's not winning you games that you were losing already. Like, there are cards in this card pool right here that are winning you losable games. The Coral engine is usually just a win more package. The Mill engine, I think, will show up. The one with Sarity, the card that recurs, Akari, all of that. Namely because you don't need it first stride, but when you go into the late game and you mill loop your opponent, that shit is so much more accessible that, like, you will actually see it so much more often. And then the final one I would like to mention that you might see, you probably won't see, but was part of the unblockable engine back in the day, was Geese. Not as a starter, you would play it in the main deck. You'd play Geese in the main deck, Barry Gearin to ride, so that you could ride Barry Gearin, pitch a Barry Gearin to stride into any of the other Zeroths. Those are the options. Really quick, I just wanted to go over matchups I had at BCS. I played against a lot of Narukami, of which I had some good games and bad games. I got fucking sacked out by my opponent in the last round. I had to G-assist and then got OT'd through my 1 winning out, which was unfortunate. I faced DP, which is a free matchup. I faced Granblue, which is a free matchup as long as you keep them out of Balan Arena range. I faced a lot of mirrors. They always opened better than I did, but I was always making sure that I was searching the pieces that closed that gap in terms of how well you open, which came up into those mirrors pre-ban list. Post-ban list, assuming more people are onto Highlander, the mirrors played very differently, but I was winning those pre-ban list mirrors in those ways, so that's something important to think of. I faced Regalia, again, Pearl Sisters absolutely came up. It is a lot of times you're only out to that deck before they start scaling outside of stunning their shit when they ride Frigg, which they shouldn't be riding Frigg against you. In terms of the other matchups, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I did just want to go over the list I took there, as well as kind of a comprehensive guide to every option and also what to expect for Worlds. If you got through all of this, I applaud you. I have been meaning to get this video out for so long, and it almost seems too late now that I'm putting it out literally right before Worlds. But I think it is crucial that if you are going into Worlds, you should absolutely watch this video because you will learn something that you didn't already know. I hope if you got this far, you enjoyed it, you learned something, you realized how insane of a deck Highlander is and how immensely high the ceiling is. I hope you got something out of it, and I'll see you at Worlds. Up with me.
What did you do to prepare? Did you do any playtesting or anything like that?
Yeah, so to prepare...